Have you ever witnessed a moment where one small decision could wipe out a person's entire future? That morning at a noisy airport gate, a young black boy stood clutching his grandfather's old violin, carrying the dream he had, sacrificed his childhood to pursue. Then, within seconds, he was pulled off the plane labeled threatening, non-compliant, endangering. A child, made suspect simply by existing. If it were you, how would you react? Would you stay quiet to avoid trouble? Or would you stand up even if the whole cabin turned its back on you? And what if I told you that waiting at the gate that day there was a man who silently saw it all? A man who, if he just opened his mouth, would change that boy's destiny forever. Do you believe that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places? A watching eye, a witness at the right moment. Join me on this journey, a painful, beautiful, and truly life-changing one. If you find stories like this important, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread more kindness together. Hartsfield, Jackson Atlanta Airport, is a strange place in the afternoon. The world shrinks, jostling under the yellow light that hangs from the ceiling, the sound of loudspeaker announcements mingling with the smell of roasting coffee and the plastic smell of rolling suitcases. People move quickly, slowly, hurriedly, or absent-mindedly in their own way, creating a chaotic but familiar rhythm, a pulse instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever set foot in an American airport. At Gate C-14, a black man in a gray softshell jacket and a vintage Braves baseball cap sat as still as a rock in a sea of people. From a distance, he looked like just another passenger waiting for an ordinary flight on an ordinary afternoon. But the truth was, nothing was ordinary here. His name was Nathaniel Brooks, 47 years old, tall, stocky, with a calm face, and the experienced features of a man who knew all too well what it meant to strive in silence. No one at Gate C-14 that day could have guessed that in a few hours he would be at the center of a story that would fundamentally change Bright Wings Airlines. And no one would think that this is the CEO of the company, the man behind every strategic decision, the brain and soul of thousands of people working at airports across America. But Nathaniel sat there, simple, thoughtful, like a man who does not want to show off his power. He had no assistant, no escort. He did not carry a large suitcase. In his hand was only a small, frayed notebook, where he recorded all the things he saw and heard during these silent inspections. He always believed that to know how an airline was running, the leader had to leave the conference room, leave behind the beautiful slides, and walk among the passengers himself. He had to see if the staff smiled at the passengers, how they responded when asked for directions, how they talked to each other. Did they work for the mission or for the heart of the profession? Today was no different. Nathaniel left the office early in the morning, took an internal flight, and stayed here to observe a few more flights. Everything was the same as before until he saw that boy. A tall, thin black teenager was holding a folding electric piano. No one in the airport paid him much attention, but Nathaniel did. He noticed the tension in the way he held the case so tight his knuckles were almost white, as if his entire life was inside the instrument, and if he let go for a second, it would all be gone. In that moment, Nathaniel felt that familiar feeling run down his spine, the feeling of someone who had been in that position, who had trembled with fear, who had held his breath for fear of a contemptuous look from someone more powerful than himself. All the memories he thought he had buried deep came alive. He remembered the first time he flew alone. Nathaniel was 14. He remembered the security guard looking him up and down suspiciously, then snatching his old backpack without a word. He remembered the sting of the man calling him boy, a short, insulting word that black Americans were used to. No one at the airport stood up for him that day. He was just a skinny black kid silently taking it all in as if it were the norm. But Nathaniel grew through it all, step by step. And now, here he was, CEO of a major airline. But he never forgot that feeling of being disrespected. Perhaps that's why he couldn't take his eyes off the young man. The boy's name was Elijah Carter, but Nathaniel didn't know that yet. He only saw that he was trying to hide his nervousness by keeping his head down, staring intently at the music book in his hands. Elijah looked at it, closed, it opened it again, as if he looked away for even a second the notes would run away. What caught Nathaniel's attention the most were his eyes. They were the eyes of a young man who was holding on to a big dream and knew that if he let it go, he would never have a second chance. Many young men his age were reckless, but Elijah was different. In his eyes was a rare determination, a calmness that only those who had experienced pain could have. A cold wind blew gently through the large glass windows of the airport. Nathaniel pulled his hat lower, trying to hide his gaze from watching Elijah. He had no idea what was about to happen. He just had a strange intuition, almost instinct, that this flight was not going to be an ordinary one. The fragile peace of Gate C-14 was suddenly interrupted by the loudspeaker announcement. Brightwing's Flight 2781 to New York will begin boarding shortly. Please prepare your boarding passes, Elijah started. He stood up, clutching the case as if he were clutching his last gamble. Nathaniel looked at him, his heart heavy with an indescribable feeling, partly because he saw himself in the past, partly because he sensed that today he was about to face something very unfair. Something that only black kids with fragile dreams have to go through so much. But then Nathaniel slowly closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He reminded himself he was here to observe, not to meddle. He needed to see how his people behaved when he wasn't in his expensive suit and entourage. He needed to see the bare truth of the system he was running. And sometimes, to see the truth, he had to stand outside, no matter how much his heart wanted to step in. Little did he know that this standing outside would be the beginning of the biggest earthquake in his career. An earthquake that started with a young boy holding a piano and a woman in a stewardess uniform approaching with a gaze that Nathaniel immediately recognized, the gaze of a small but prejudiced power. The storm was just beginning to form, but no one knew it yet. And Nathaniel, the man who seemed to be just watching, would soon learn that there are times one must not stand aside. The morning he left South Carolina was a little misty. Elijah Carter stood in front of his house, his folding electric piano hanging from his hip, his grandmother's wooden music box in his backpack. He touched it gently in a ritualistic way, like placing a hand over his heart to remind himself of the most sacred thing. Elijah wasn't a loud teenager. He lived quietly, preferring evenings in his small room, the yellow light shining on the keys of his grandmother's old piano, the music whispering in the house after his mother slept. His music wasn't loud. It was gentle, a little reserved, as if he were asking the world for permission to exist. But only those who have heard him play know behind that shyness lies an incredibly powerful inner strength. His mother, Monica Carter, used to say, "Music is how your relatives talk to you from the other side. Just play, just be kind, and they will be happy." Today, Elijah left home to audition for Juilliard. He made it to the next round, something thousands of kids dream of but few achieve. This trip was like a ray of light in a long, dark journey for mother and son. People looked at Elijah and saw a tall, skinny black teenager with short, curly hair and a gray hoodie like any other kid. But they didn't see the nights he practiced until his fingers were numb. They didn't see his mother skipping dinner to save money for the plane ticket. And they didn't see the invisible burden Elijah carried, the burden of race in a world that still wasn't truly fair. That morning, Monica stood at the door adjusting Elijah's collar as if he were still 6 years old. Before getting into the car, she put both hands on his shoulders. "Remember what I said?" she asked. Elijah nodded slightly. "Yes, I remember. There will be people in this world who will look at you with the wrong eyes. They don't know you. They don't know how good you are. But don't let their eyes determine your worth." Elijah swallowed. "Mom, I'm scared." "You're allowed to be scared," Monica said, her eyes softening. "But don't let fear dictate your actions. Be kind, be patient, be polite. And remember, you're not going alone. Your grandmother is with you, I'm with you, and the music is with you." He hugged his mother, breathing in her familiar scent, coconut oil and cheap soap. To Elijah, it was the smell of peace. As the long-distance bus rolled toward Atlanta to catch his connecting flight, Elijah set his piano case on his lap. He gently opened the lid, revealing the black and white keys that had been carefully wiped last night. Beside them lay her music book, its edges yellowed with age. Elijah turned to the first page, her unfinished score. Only the last few lines of notes were never finished. He smiled sadly. "I will finish it, Grandma." The bus stopped in Atlanta around noon. Elijah got off, pulled his backpack over his shoulder, hugged his guitar to his chest, and walked into the airport. Every time he stepped into a large airport, he felt strangely small, a drop of water lost in a vast sea of people. But today the feeling was stronger than ever, not because of the crowd, but because of the responsibility. You have to get to New York on time. You have to sleep early. You have to check your instruments. You have to save your energy for tomorrow. Everything has only one chance. He checked in and passed through security pretty quickly. Luckily, the person checking today was a black man in his 40s. Seeing his guitar case, he asked cheerfully, "Do you play the piano?" "Yes, I'm preparing for the audition." "Oh, come on, be confident." Those words of encouragement were simple, but for Elijah, they were the first bright spot of the day. He went to gate C14 and sat down. He opened his music book, looking at the familiar notes to reassure himself. But then, when he looked up, he saw an older black man looking at him with a calm but somehow warm gaze. It was Nathaniel Brooks, but Elijah didn't know him. To him, he was just a plain-looking, successful black guy with a baseball cap pulled low. Elijah nodded politely as his mother had told him to. Nathaniel returned the nod, small and light as a blessing. A gust of air conditioning blew a sheet of paper from Elijah's notebook to Nathaniel's feet. He bent down to pick it up, glanced at the notes, and handed it back. "Do you play music?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes, I play the piano. Are you going to take the exam?" Elijah was a little surprised. "How did you know?" "Look at your eyes. People who dream of taking exams often have a very unique look." He blushed. "I'm a little worried." "It's good to worry," Nathaniel said. "It means you appreciate what you're doing." There was a moment of very light silence. Elijah gripped the guitar case tighter. "I'm afraid people won't like me," he whispered. "Don't like me because of the music, or because of other things?" Nathaniel asked, his tone unchanged. Elijah bowed his head. "Because I am black." Nathaniel looked at him longer, his eyes soft but deep. He knew this feeling. Too familiar. "You can't control other people's eyes," he said slowly. "You can only control how you react to them. And you're doing well." Elijah's lips moved, wanting to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. There was something in Nathaniel's voice that made him trust him, as if he knew the uncertainty inside. "Good luck," Nathaniel said, turning away. Elijah watched his retreating figure. Somewhere in his heart he felt a little lighter. Time passed slowly. Elijah kept checking the time. His hand kept touching the case to make sure it was safe. Every time he heard the announcement of a delay or cancellation over the loudspeaker, his heart would jump. "Roi, Loa Vang Len Bright Wings Flight 2781 to New York will begin boarding in a few minutes." Elijah swallowed, tightening the straps of his backpack. He was ready. Or you think you are ready. But life, as usual, always has challenges that young people cannot predict. And that challenge today is in the name of Diana Cross, the woman who will show Elijah what injustice is, what abuse of power is, and what it means to stand up for yourself even when your hands are shaking. The loudspeaker announcements drifted through the air again, echoing like the distant call of a lost bird in a gray sky. People were still walking, still laughing, still dragging suitcases across the polished tile floors of the Atlanta airport. But in the waiting area next to gate C14, Nathaniel Brooks felt as if time had slowed down. He glanced to his right where Elijah sat, his hands clutching the guitar case as if it were his only lifeline in a sea of people. His grandmother's music book lay open on his lap, the notes breathing, telling the story of a family that had weathered many storms. That indescribable feeling returned. The feeling of someone who had once stood in that child's shoes. Nathaniel sat up straight, his hand unconsciously touching the edge of his notebook. Today he had intended to just observe the passengers, evaluate the procedures, note the staff's attitudes, and then quietly leave like any other inspection trip. But then the young man appeared, bringing with him old memories that Nathaniel thought he had locked away in the deepest corner of his heart. More than 30 years ago, also at a major American airport, a 14-year-old boy named Nathaniel Brooks stood in the security line with an old backpack and a folder containing some self-written music. He had no guitar, only a dream of studying music in a class for gifted students in another city. When it was his turn, Nathaniel smiled and greeted the man in charge of baggage check. The response was a glance heavy as a stone thrown into water. "Hey, boy, open your bag." That word, boy. One word, but it held layers of meaning that no one needed to explain. Nathaniel stood there, his heart beating faster than normal. He opened his backpack, revealing several notebooks with music notes. The clerk picked one up and turned it over in his hand, frowning as if he were hiding something dangerous. "Music, huh? You sure this is yours?" "Yes, sir, I wrote it." The man sneered. "You kids only know how to draw graffiti. Go away." Those words that day made Nathaniel choke, not because of humiliation, but because he knew clearly, here he had no right to argue. No one would stand up for him, and no one cared if he was good or had dreams. As he walked, Nathaniel could still feel that skeptical gaze following him like a shadow that wouldn't leave. That memory, though faded over the years, still left an indelible mark in my heart. A wound that doesn't bleed, but always aches whenever I see the image of a scared black child like Elijah. Nathaniel glanced back at Elijah. He was trying to concentrate on his music book, but every time the airport speakers blared, his head jerked slightly like someone holding a fragile soul in his arms, afraid a strong wind might blow it away. He didn't want to intervene. Not because he was insensitive, but because he knew all too well that his job today was to observe how his own system worked when he was not in the spotlight. A CEO only understands his employees when he sees them from behind the curtain, not from the front stage. But he didn't ignore it. His eyes followed Elijah every little movement he made, every deep breath he took to steady his heart. A father watches over his son like that. A wounded person watches over his young ones like that. A caring leader watches over his employees and passengers like that. On the screen before him, Flight 2781's destination was clearly visible New York. Another memory suddenly came flooding back. It was a city Nathaniel both loved and feared. Loved because it was where he began his career. Feared because it was also where he learned to endure the loneliness of being a young black man in a harsh corporate environment. It took him years to rise to the top. And when he did, he vowed that no child in his company would be mistreated because of the color of their skin, their accent, or their background. But no matter how strong the oath, there are always cracks in the system. And sometimes those cracks only show when a child like Elijah walks into the right place at the right time. Nathaniel knew that better than anyone. A faint metallic sound rang out as a flight attendant pulled a cart past. Nathaniel snapped out of his reverie and looked around. He noticed the indifference with which some of the staff interacted with passengers. He noticed the lack of tact in a pair of young flight attendants laughing too loudly behind the counter. He noticed the unreadable expression on Diana Cross's face, the woman with the sharp eyes of a blade who had just passed by in her Bright Wings uniform. Diana didn't look around with a servile gaze. It was more like she was scanning the airport for someone else's fault. A look Nathaniel had seen too many times in the past. The look of people who believe they have the right to control everything, even when it's not theirs. He exhaled slowly. I hope she doesn't see Elijah today, he thought. The boy doesn't deserve anything more than that. What an irony. In just a few dozen minutes, that very look would become the fuel for the storm Nathaniel would have to face. Elijah stood up and walked toward the check-in counter. He adjusted the strap of his guitar case, checked his ticket, and then looked around as if to make sure he hadn't done anything wrong. His old sneakers clicked softly with each step. Nathaniel felt each step like his own cautious but hopeful. He wanted to say something more to Elijah, to tell him not to be afraid, to tell him he believed he could do it, but he held back. Not because he was hesitant, but because he didn't want to interrupt his journey too soon. He understands what it means to let a young person overcome fear on his own. A dream is only truly strong when the person carrying it dares to step through the door with their own 2 feet. Nathaniel let Elijah go, but his eyes followed him until he stopped at the boarding line. He stood in a line of people of all colors and classes, yet Elijah seemed to stand alone. He saw his shoulders shake. He saw him reach out and stroke the case, as if his grandmother were standing behind him, hugging him. And he saw the glimmer of hope in Elijah's eyes when the gate attendant announced, "Boarding groups 1 and 2, please line up." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a few seconds. He had thought he was stronger than the hurt, but moments like these taught him that some wounds never go away. They just lie dormant, waiting for a frightened look like his own at 14 to revive them. Once again he whispered as if to himself, "I hope nothing happens to you today, Elijah. I hope my system doesn't hurt you." But deep in my chest, a small, vague, but sharp premonition still stirred incessantly. A hunch he didn't want to believe, but couldn't ignore. Because sometimes, before the storm comes, people's hearts will tremble very slightly. Very slightly. But anyone who has been through a storm will recognize it. The boarding call rang out, echoing through the crowded space like the opening bell of an unknown play. Elijah stood in line, his hand shaking slightly on the strap of his guitar case. He tried to take a deep breath as if just one breath would calm his heart. Behind him, a boy about 10 years old waved his hand at the guitar case and asked his mother, "Mom, what's that?" The mother smiled softly. A piano, sweetie. Elijah turned back a small smile on his face. Ah, it's a folding piano. It's very light. The boy's eyes lit up. You play. Elijah nodded. I just played a little. The remark was light as air, but it contained a humility that was so characteristic of Elijah. He always said, just a little while, his former teachers once said that he had an ability to play music as if he had lived another life. After meeting Nathaniel earlier, Elijah felt a little more at ease. He didn't know why. Maybe it was because the man had looked at him with eyes that Elijah hadn't seen much in his short life. The eyes of someone who understood the secret worries inside a black child, trying to hold on to the future with trembling hands. When boarding began, the first group of passengers filed in. Elijah stood in the back so he had more time to look along the aisle toward the door. He imagined where he would be sitting, the narrow seat, the smell of plastic, the sound of a baby crying somewhere, and tried to tell himself that none of it mattered. It's important that you get to New York. You have to go to the audition. He placed his hand on his shirt where his mother had pinned a small music note pin that morning. For luck, she said. Elijah touched it again as if in private prayer. Then the line moved forward. And that's when Diana Cross appeared in the doorway of the plane. Diana stood straight, her back as stiff as hastily welded steel. She was about 48, slim but sharp-boned. Her features were carefully made up, giving her a cold, professional look, and her eyes were like two blades that swept over each passenger. To many, she was just a veteran flight attendant. But to those who flew with her, they knew she had a way of making people feel like they were always wrong. Wrong for standing in the wrong line. Wrong for holding her handbag a little too long. Wrong for asking for more information. Wrong for breathing, not at the rhythm she wanted. Diana has a strange kind of power. The power to think she's always right. Today, that gaze was scanning over each person boarding the plane, and it stopped when Elijah reached the cabin door. In the first second, Elijah just bowed his head and said, "Good afternoon, ma'am." But Diana didn't return the greeting. Instead, her eyes were fixed on his guitar case. She jerked her chin. "That thing. What is it?" Elijah lifted the case gently. A folding piano. I checked the dimensions on the website. Diana interrupted immediately, her voice sharp as breaking glass. "No, oversized. You'll need to gate check it," Elijah jerked. "No, sir. This instrument is fragile. I really need to keep it with me. And I told you." Diana's voice was colder than the air from the air-conditioned cabin. "You cannot bring that on board." Elijah bit his lip, trying to remain polite. "Ma'am, I was just trying to put it in the overhead bin. It should fit." He spoke in a low voice, as if afraid his own voice would be disturbing. But to Diana, the slight didn't matter. What mattered was that she had just been interpreted by a teenager, and she hated it. A thin smile appeared on her lips, enough to signal that Elijah had just taken a wrong step. "Move aside, Banoy. You're slowing the line." Elijah froze. Behind him, the crowd was starting to get uneasy. Sighs, grumbling, the rattling of a suitcase pushing against his back. Just then, a young flight attendant, Ron Matthews, about 25 years old, walked out. Ron looked gentle, his eyes warm, completely different from Diana's. He looked at Elijah and tilted his head to ask, "Instrument?" Elijah nodded, hoping for some light. Ron looked at the case, checked the dimensions, then whispered to Elijah, "This one should actually fit just fine. The overhead bins on this aircraft are wide." Elijah breathed a sigh of relief. But immediately Diana turned around. "Ron." Her voice was like the sound of grinding metal. "Are you confirming you want to override my instruction?" Ron immediately bowed his head. "No, ma'am, I thought it." "Then step back. Cut off. No negotiation." Elijah tried to regain his composure. "Ma'am, I'm sorry if I'm bothering you. I just wanted to try." His voice was as soft as a compressed harp. Diana shook her head, raised her hand, and pointed toward the plane door as if giving an order. "Gate check. Now." Elijah took a deep breath. Once, twice. His mother's words echoed in his head. "Be kind. Be patient." He nodded slightly. "Well, let me try it on. If it doesn't fit, I'll take it." Ron looked at Diana as if wanting to intervene further, but her eyes seemed to warn him not to open his mouth. Elijah stepped into the cabin. The person behind him nudged him in the back, making him stumble slightly, but still holding on to the guitar case. He went to a row of seats with an empty space in the overhead bin, opened the door, and slowly put the guitar case in. And as Ron said, it fit. Not just barely, but with almost an inch to spare. Elijah turned back, smiling, the softest smile. "Ma'am, it fits perfectly." Ron saw it, his face brightening slightly. But Diana stood there, her eyes dark as the sky before a storm. In a split second, Elijah realized he had made an unspeakable mistake. He had made Diana look wrong. For someone like her, it's not just annoying, it's insulting. Diana moved closer, standing close enough for Elijah to smell the strong, steely scent of perfume. "Take it down." 3 words separate, like an officer's command. Elijah swallowed. "Yes, but it fits, ma'am. I don't." Diana's voice rose so loud that several passengers turned around. "You are now being non-compliant." The word non-compliant fell like a sledgehammer. Anyone who has flown in the United States knows this is no ordinary word. It is the key that opens a chain of consequences, from writing a ticket to calling security to even being forced off the plane. Elijah stood frozen. His hands shook. His mind was as tangled as a sheet of fabric on a spindle. "Ma'am, I just enough," Diana Quay sang Ron. "Call the captain. We have a situation." Ron paled. "Ma'am, maybe we can now." The whole cabin was silent. The air was thick with the scent of an impending storm. Elijah felt like his legs were giving out. His heart was beating so fast he was afraid someone nearby could hear it. "You didn't do anything wrong. You just put the instrument on overhead. It fit. That's all." But why did things turn out like this? Why did everyone's gazes change in just a few seconds? Why did he feel like he was being accused of something that didn't exist? The old fear came flooding back, the fear that black children learn from a very young age, one misunderstanding, and life can turn out differently. Elijah looked around, hoping someone would speak for him. But people just wanted to get on the plane, just wanted to fly fast, just wanted to be safe. Nobody wants trouble. And in that moment, Elijah felt small. Like the first day his grandmother took him to music class and the kids teased him because of the color of his skin. Only, today was much worse. Behind him in the row by the door, Nathaniel Brooks watched the whole thing. Every frown, every word, every drop of fear on Elijah's hand. And his eyes changed color. No longer an observing gaze. No longer the gaze of a leader wanting to check the system. It was the look of a man who had been looked down upon, and would not allow it to happen again in front of him. The storm was brewing. But Diana Cross didn't know that the silent black man was no ordinary passenger. He was the most powerful person on this plane, and her fate was about to take an unexpected turn. The moment Diana Cross called Ron to get the captain, the atmosphere in the cabin froze. The usually noisy rows were now so quiet that you could hear someone opening a soda can in the very back of the plane. Elijah stood in the aisle like a leaf caught between 2 opposing winds. One side was the life he had worked so hard to preserve. The other was the storm of power that was coming regardless of right or wrong. He couldn't speak. His throat was dry. The feeling of being seen as a troublemaker made Elijah choke, as it had when he was 8 years old, the first time a mall security guard stopped him for a bag check, even though he'd done nothing but stand there waiting for his mother to try on clothes, a feeling that black children learn to recognize too early. Diana stood directly in front of Elijah, her arms crossed. Her navy blue uniform cast a long, dark shadow that swallowed the light behind her. "You defied a direct instruction," she said, her voice even but sharp. "You are causing a disturbance." Elijah shook his head, trying to catch his breath. "Ma'am, I just put the instrument on overhead. I wasn't messing around. Don't raise your voice at me." Her voice rose a little. Just a little. But enough to make it seem like Elijah was making a fuss, even though the opposite was true. Elijah leaned down, his voice shaking slightly. "I didn't raise my voice. I just—" Diana sighed heavily as if she were enduring some kind of insolence. "You're being aggressive." The word aggressive dropped to the floor like a stone. Some passengers frowned slightly. A few others furtively took out their phones, a reflex when they sensed trouble. Elijah's eyes widened. "Ma'am, I'm not being aggressive. I just—" "Enough," Diana interrupted, lifting her chin. "You're not flying today. Step outside." He stood there, stunned. "Ma'am, please don't be like this. I need to go to New York. I have an audition tomorrow." "I don't." Diana shook her head as if his words had no value. Her voice was cold as ice. "If you don't step out, I'll have security escort you out." Elijah felt like someone had knocked the breath out of him. He looked around for someone to say something, but everyone just wanted the plane to take off, just wanted peace, just wanted it to be over. Ron Matthews stood behind Diana. His face was filled with helplessness and concern. He knew Elijah was right. He had seen it all from the start. But Diana's gaze, warning, threatening, kept his feet planted firmly on the floor. "Ma'am," Ron managed to say, "maybe we should run Diana Quayle. Return to your station." And this time her voice was so sharp that Ron stiffened. Elijah took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. He had one chance to get to New York, one chance only, and it was being crushed by a baseless accusation. He turned back to look at the overhead bin, the instrument, lying still snug, harmless as the only proof that he had done nothing wrong. But that evidence is worthless when the authority says otherwise. He stood there, his heart pounding, then breathed out a whisper. "Ma'am, please look for me. I'm not being aggressive. I'm just afraid the guitar will be damaged." Diana looked at him like he was a liar. "Step outside." And that was the moment Nathaniel Brooks stood up. He placed his notebook on the seat beside him, adjusted his baseball cap, and walked up the aisle. His steps were slow and steady, quiet, but with an air of authority that made several passengers look up. Ron saw him approaching, his eyes widening in warning, but Nathaniel just shook his head slightly as if to say, "I know what I'm doing." Standing a few steps away from Elijah, Nathaniel spoke in a low, calm voice. "What exactly happened here?" Diana turned back a little impatient. "Sir, please return to your seat. We're handling a non-compliant passenger." Nathaniel didn't move. His eyes lingered on Elijah, the slight tremor in his shoulders, the tight grip on the guitar strap in his hand, until his knuckles turned white. "Non-compliant Nathaniel," repeated his voice, soft, but loud enough for Diana to hear. "This boy, Diana Thurra. Yes, he refused my instruction and created a disturbance. We need him off this aircraft." Elijah opened his mouth, but Nathaniel shook his head slightly as if telling him to stay still. He turned to Diana. "He made trouble by doing what? By refusing to check an oversized item." Diana Dapp. "He then argued with me." Elijah whispered, "I didn't argue." Diana looked at Elijah with a look that would silence that voice. He did. The atmosphere became tense. Ron looked down like a man caught between morality and fear of losing his job. Nathaniel looked at the case, then opened the overhead bin. He checked the width and height, then removed the case and replaced it again very lightly, very clearly. It fits. Not just fits, but fits sweetly. Nathaniel stepped aside, facing Diana. "It fits," he said, "perfectly. Diana Conmoy." "Sir, with all due respect, this is a crew decision. Please take your seat." "Nathaniel Noy Chum Rai, and I'm asking you to reconsider your assessment before escalating." Diana narrowed her eyes, annoyed. "Sir, you are interfering with crew operations." Elijah shook his head quickly. "No, he's not." Diana raised her hand as if to cut him off. "Security will be here any minute." A rustling sound came from the back of the cabin. One of the passengers started rolling his camera. Another whispered, "He didn't do anything." But Diana stood upright as if in absolute power. Elijah felt like everything was spinning fast, like the clock of his life was about to run out of sand because of 3 false statements. "Ma'am," Elijah tried to keep his composure again. "Please, I really need to get to New York." "Then you should have followed instructions, Diana Dapp." A sob rose in Elijah's throat. He didn't want to cry. Not here, not in front of strangers. But he knew the weight of Diana's words could throw his life off course. A dream suffocated by a prejudice. Nathaniel slowly took a step forward, his voice low almost, so that only Diana could hear. "You're calling security on a child who put a musical instrument in an empty overhead bin." Diana pursed her lips. He was aggressive. The words made Elijah jerk as if he had been slapped. He shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "I wasn't. I swear I wasn't." Nathaniel leaned in a gentle shield in front of Elijah. He didn't need to speak, but his eyes said it all. "I won't let anyone touch you." Then he turned to Diana. "Did you see him being aggressive, Ong Hoi Ron Tung Chu? Or did you decide he was aggressive?" Diana was confused for a moment, but quickly regained her composure. "I stand by my report." Nathaniel was silent, a silence that was not loud but heavy as a rock. He reached into his pocket as if to take something out. But just then, the radio crackled from the plane door. 2 security guards entered. Elijah took a step back. He was shaking. Diana held her head high like a winner. But Nathaniel, he just let out a small breath, then pressed his lips together in a cold line. A signal curve. The real storm is about to hit. Two security officers entered the cabin, their black boots clicking decisively on the floor. One was shorter, the other tall, with a belt full of equipment. Both wore neutral expressions, not hostile, not curious, but cold enough to make Elijah feel as if he were no longer a passenger but a case to be dealt with. Elijah backed all the way down the aisle, his back hitting the edge of the seat. He tried to stand up, but his knees wouldn't stop shaking. His eyes scanned the cabin, searching for some safe spot, but there was none. No seat for him. No gaze strong enough to defend him. Elijah felt like he was floating in a vacuum, as if he were weightless. Ron Matthews stood beside him, his hands clasped together as if he wanted to shout, "Elijah is innocent," but an invisible string was tied around his neck. Nathaniel Brooks stood half a step in front of Elijah, saying nothing, but his shoulders were broad and solid as a wall. One of the two security guards spoke up. "Is there a problem here, Nathaniel?" Lowered his voice without turning around, just replied, "Yes." Diana interrupted immediately, as if afraid to let him speak first. "Yes, there is a problem. This passenger is non-compliant and becoming aggressive. He refused crew instructions." Both security guards looked at Elijah. Of course they had to. The entire system needed only a word from the uniformed man to shift their gaze. Elijah looked up, trying to say something, but only a weak sound came out of his throat. I wasn't aggressive." "I didn't," Diana interrupted, her voice raised in feigned fear. He raised his voice. "He got close to me. I didn't feel safe." "Ma'am," Elijah started, but it came out as a sob. In the crowd, some people whispered, "Poor kid. Did he really yell?" "I didn't hear anything. Just let security figure it out." An elderly man sitting near the window shook his head. "That attendant's the one yelling, not him, but that word is too small to make a difference." The security guard stepped forward, his voice not heavy but very clear. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Elijah stood frozen. "Why, I didn't do anything. Please." "Diana, Koante, this is for the safety of the aircraft." Those words were like scissors cutting off Elijah's last hope. Nathaniel took a deep breath as if holding something in his chest. He said in a low but sharp voice, "You're making a mistake." One of the two security guards turned slightly to Nathaniel. "Sir, please step aside. We were calling." Diana looked at Nathaniel as if he were the second troublemaker. "Sir, unless you want to be removed as well." Nathaniel turned around, his eyes sharp as the cut of a steel knife. "Finish that sentence," he said slowly. "I'm sure you don't dare." Diana was silent. For 2 seconds, her whole body froze. She didn't know who he was, but the aura he exuded made even the air recede a little. But fear of losing face made her retort, albeit weakly, "Sir, please let them do their job." Nathaniel did not reply. He looked down at Elijah. The boy was shaking. His eyes were red. His fingers gripped the guitar case so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Elijah," Nathaniel said, his voice surprisingly warm, "you did nothing wrong." Elijah's lips moved. "But they think Let me handle this," Nathaniel said. "But before I do, you have to stand firm." "Do you hear me?" Elijah nodded, but his eyes were still blurred. The security guard took a step forward. "Sir, please, step off the aircraft." Elijah shook his head in despair. "Why? Why I didn't yell? I didn't touch anyone. I only put my piano in." A tear fell down his cheek, hot as oil. "Diana Neumann." He refused orders. He argued. "He made me feel threatened. That is enough." Nathaniel turned to her. "Threatened," he repeated, "by a 17-year-old carrying a folding piano." His voice wasn't high, but it had gravity, and it cut straight into the ridiculousness of Diana's words. "Nyung Diana Gatti, sir, step back or you will also be cited." Nathaniel chuckled. A dangerous laugh. "Cited. Interesting." He took out a small leather wallet and withdrew a card, but he did not raise it immediately. He simply held it between his fingers like a weapon waiting for the right moment. "Before I show this," he said word by word, "I want to ask a question." He pointed to the overhead bin. "Does that instrument pose a safety hazard?" Ron Matthews stepped forward immediately, his voice trembling but determined. "No, sir. It fits perfectly." A passenger in row 11 said loudly, "I saw it fit." The kid didn't argue. He just placed it in. An older woman added, "Why are you treating him like this? He didn't do anything." More voices began to rise. A small wave spread. For the first time since the incident began, Elijah was not completely alone. Diana bit her lip, feeling the situation slipping away. "Everyone stay out of official crew matters." Nathaniel turned to Diana. "That," he said softly. "You'll want to take it back in a few seconds." Then he held up the card. Not tall, not flashy, but Diana recognized it immediately. Logo, name, position. Nathaniel Brooks, President and Chief Executive Officer, Bright Wings Airlines. Diana turned pale. Ron opened his mouth, speechless. The two security guards stopped as well as if they had just realized they had stepped into a huge play. Nathaniel said, his voice low but sharp as a hook hooked into the heart. "She called a black boy aggressive when he just put his instrument on overhead. I was 3 rows back. I heard the whole thing. I saw the whole thing." He stepped closer to Diana. "And I can see clearly who is causing trouble." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Nathaniel didn't give her a chance. "You called security out of pride, not for safety. You tried to make your mistake look like a child's fault. You disregarded the truth, abused your power, and affected innocent passengers." Elijah's eyes turned from pain to surprise. Nathaniel continued each word like a nail hammered into a board. "And that is something I will not tolerate on any aircraft with the Bright Wings name on it." Diana swallowed. Mr. Brooks, Nathaniel raised his hand, signaling her to stop. "Security," he said, turning to the 2 men standing behind him. "Please escort this flight attendant off the plane. She is relieved of duty, effective immediately." The whole cabin held its breath. One of the security guards whispered, "Yes, sir." Elijah looked at the scene with wide eyes, both shocked and in disbelief. Nathaniel turned to Elijah gently like a father. "Elijah, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to New York." He stood there, tears falling not from fear, but from a suffocating relief. For the first time in his life, in the middle of a situation where he should have been crushed, someone stood in front of him. A black man. A black CEO. Someone who understands the fears of kids like him. And the storm began to change direction. As 2 security guards escorted Diana Cross out of the cabin, the plane fell into an eerie silence. Not a silence of fear, but a silence of shock that left people unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Elijah stood in the middle of the aisle, his hand still on the guitar case as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling. He watched Diana being led away, her eyes no longer cold. They were replaced with genuine terror. She mumbled a few words to the security, but no one could understand. The footsteps faded into the distance. In the cabin, a woman in row 9 whispered, "Good." Someone needed to stop her. A man added, "About time." But no one dared say anything. They were still stunned to realize that the person standing up for Elijah wasn't just a passenger, but the head of the entire airline. Nathaniel turned his eyes, softening as he looked at Elijah. He placed a hand on his shoulder. A light touch, not imposing, but enough to bring Elijah back down to earth. "Elijah, are you okay?" Nathaniel asked. Elijah pressed his lips together to keep his voice from shaking. "I'm fine. It's just, I'm scared." "You have a right to be scared," Nathaniel said. "But you did nothing wrong." "Do you understand?" Elijah nodded. Tears still fell this time, but they weren't as heavy. Something warmed in his chest, a feeling that black children don't always get protection. Ron Matthews stood behind him, his hands still shaking slightly from the shock of the past few minutes. He looked at Elijah, then at Nathaniel, as if to apologize. "Sir, I'm so sorry, Ron Noi Jong Ngen Lai. I should have said something earlier. I knew she was wrong." Nathaniel turned to Ron. "Ron, you tried. I saw that. But I also saw the fear in your eyes." "Afraid of losing your job, right?" Ron bowed his head. "Yes, sir." "You're not alone," Nathaniel replied. "This system sometimes discourages young people from speaking up. I'm going to fix that." Ron looked up, his eyes wet. "Thank you, sir." Nathaniel nodded slightly, then he gestured for Elijah to sit down in an empty row of chairs nearby. But the matter is not over. Because the captain had just stepped out of the cockpit, Captain Reedman, a tall, middle-aged man with a tanned face and unsightly drawn-together eyebrows, he had no idea what had just happened. No idea who had just been removed from the plane. And even less that the man standing before him was the CEO. "Excuse me," Captain Reedman said, his voice hoarse but filled with the authority of someone used to commanding. "What is going on? Why was my lead flight attendant removed from this flight?" Ron looked at Nathaniel as if waiting for him to make a decision. But Nathaniel remained, still waiting for the captain to reveal his attitude. Captain Reedman stepped forward, facing Nathaniel. "Sir, I need a clear answer. Who authorized this?" Nathaniel did not speak at once. He looked the captain straight in the eye. The look made Reedman flinch, but he stood tall and kept his voice firm. "Sir, you cannot disrupt my crew mid-flight prep Truong Noi. We're already delayed. This is highly irregular." A passenger in row 10 whispered, "He doesn't know." Another whispered, "Oh boy, this is gonna be something." Elijah tightened his grip on the lute, his eyes following the two men, one powerful by title, one powerful by spirit. Nathaniel finally spoke up. "Captain Reedman, I saw the whole thing." The captain folded his arms. And I saw this boy." Nathaniel pointed at Elijah being treated unfairly, being falsely accused, being threatened with calling security just for putting a musical instrument in the overhead bin. Captain Reedman, "Numai." "Sir, with all due respect, that is the flight attendant's call. She must have had a reason." "She said he was aggressive," Nathaniel said. "I was 3 rows back. He never raised his voice, never made any threatening gestures." "Sir, I can't rely on passenger feedback to judge the crew's behavior," Reedman replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "We have training, we have procedures. If the lead attendant says it's unsafe, I have to believe her." Nathaniel took a half step forward. "Even if it's wrong," Captain Reedman froze. "Sir, I don't." "Do you know what you just said?" Nathaniel asked, his voice low and sharp. "You just said you would trust the crew even if they were wrong. No need to verify. No need to observe. No need to hear from the passengers." The captain opened his mouth, but Nathaniel didn't give him the chance. He pulled out his card, this time holding it up clearly. The cabin light reflected off the words Nathaniel Brooks, President and Chief Executive Officer, Bright Wings Airlines. The captain turned pale. His mouth opened and closed. No words came out. Several passengers gasped softly. "Oh my God! No way! Is that really?" Nathaniel said, his voice cold like a battlefield commander. "I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to fix your system." Your lead attendant lied, abused his authority, used the word aggressive on a black kid even though he was just standing there. Reedman swallowed eyes, looking at Elijah, then at Diana, who was being led out the cabin door. Nathaniel continued, "Do you know what the word aggressive can do to a black passenger? It can get them pulled over. It can get them booked. It can get them missed out on an important opportunity. It can be treated like a criminal before they even open their mouth." Captain Reedman bowed his head, losing his authoritative voice for the first time. "Sir, I didn't know." "You should know," Nathaniel replied immediately. "You're flying a plane with over 100 people on board. You can't trust anyone blindly, not even the crew." Ron stood behind watching the scene, his heart pounding like a drum. He had never seen a CEO speak so directly without evasion or beating around the bush. Nathaniel Quay sang Reedman, "You have 2 choices." The whole cabin held its breath. 1, you can call the ground operator and say you are not qualified to continue this flight. The captain opened his eyes wide. 2, you apologize to this boy for believing the false report. Apologize to the passengers for the delay. And continue the flight with proper attitude. The air was as tense as a string stretched to its limit. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Then Captain Reedman took a deep breath. He stepped forward to Elijah. "Bow. Son, I'm sorry. I made a mistake." Elijah's eyes widened in disbelief. The captain, a man older, more powerful, was bowing to him. Nathaniel looked at Elijah, nodding slightly as if to prompt him to respond. Elijah swallowed hard and said in a low voice, I just didn't do anything wrong, sir." "I know," said the captain, "and I'm sorry I didn't check before acting." A passenger in row 8 clapped softly, then another, then the whole cabin. Not a loud applause, but the applause of people who had just witnessed something rare, someone being allowed to admit a mistake. Captain Reedman, Quaylai cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be continuing preparations for departure. Again, my sincere apologies for this delay." Then he turned to Nathaniel. "Sir, thank you for correcting me." Nathaniel replied calmly, "My job is to protect every person who steps on our aircraft, even if the person in need of protection is a boy standing alone in the midst of misunderstanding." Elijah sat down on the chair, his hands on the case, but the feeling in his chest was different. No more shaking, no more fear, no more heaviness. For the first time all day, he felt like he had a right to be here. And the plane ready to take off is returning to its orbit. The door closed. But the wave of change was just beginning. The cabin slowly quieted down as if everyone was sorting through their emotions. The steady hum of the engine outside created a solid background sound that made the atmosphere in the cabin less heavy. Elijah sat by the window, his hands resting on the guitar case which was neatly placed at his feet. He was still shaking slightly, like the aftershocks of a storm that had just passed. But there was no panic in his eyes. Instead, there was gratitude, and something like a smoldering fire, the kind that forms when a child finally sees that his dreams are not entirely alone. Nathaniel Brooks stood a few feet away, chatting briefly with Ron Matthews and Captain Reedman to make sure everything was in order. But his eyes kept glancing back at Elijah as if he were watching something fragile he didn't want to break again. When the examination was over, Nathaniel walked over and sat down in the row next to Elijah. He didn't speak right away. He just stayed quiet, letting the air slow down like breathing after a long run. Elijah turned his eyes, still red. "Mr. Brooks, thank you," he said softly, his voice trembling. "If it weren't for you, I might have been taken away." Nathaniel looked at him, his eyes somewhat softer than when he confronted Diana and the captain. "Elijah, you owe me no thanks," he said. "What you deserve today is justice. Nothing more, nothing less." Elijah bowed his head. "But I was almost given a non-existent fault. That," Nathaniel said slowly, "happened to many people like you, and like me." Elijah looked up surprised. Nathaniel smiled slightly, a sad smile more than a happy one. "I was once a boy like you. I once stood in front of a security guard who told me I was behaving suspiciously because I was looking at the ground for too long. The first time I went on a business trip, I was asked to stand aside while others walked straight ahead." He smiled slightly, but the smile could not hide the old wound. "I learned that sometimes just because you're black, a normal action can be interpreted in the worst way." Elijah swallowed. "I have never heard anyone speak so bluntly." "I don't say that to scare you," Nathaniel replied, placing his hands on the chair in front of him, "but to let you know that you are not lost in this fight. You are not alone." For the first time, Elijah felt something heavy in his heart, but it was the weight of truth, not fear. The engine began to hum louder. Ron walked through the cabin, checking the passengers' seatbelts. He stopped next to Elijah, resting his hand lightly on the back of the seat. "Hey," Ron said softly enough for only Elijah to hear. "I'm glad you stayed. You deserve to be on this plane." Elijah smiled slightly. "Thank you for telling the truth." Ron nodded, his eyes slightly red. "I'll do better next time." Nathaniel watched the scene, his eyes deep. He saw in Ron the image of young employees full of potential but held back by fear. And he saw Elijah, a man both wounded and behaving with rare kindness. He thought to himself, both of them deserve a better environment. As Ron walked away, Elijah turned back to Nathaniel. "Mr. Brooks, when you stood up in front of Diana, I've never seen anyone do that for someone like me." Nathaniel tilted his head. "Someone like me?" What Elijah looked down at his hands. "I don't have much money. I don't know anyone. I'm just a black kid with an old guitar. When things happen, I have to be quiet, because if I talk any louder, people think I'm aggressive." His voice dropped like a secret confession. "I learned to keep to myself, so as not to be seen as a problem." Hearing this, Nathaniel's shoulders drooped slightly, as if someone had touched a place that had hurt for a long time. "Elijah, you were not born to be a shut-in," he said. "Some people will want you to be quiet. Some people will make you feel small. But you play music. Your music needs space to resonate." "But if they don't give me space?" Elijah asked. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. "Then you have to create your own space. Your music is proof that you exist. And exist beautifully." Elijah was silent. He looked out the window where the runway stretched out like a road with no end. He thought of his mother, his grandmother, the evenings he spent practicing the piano until his fingers were sore. He thought of the class where people laughed when he said he wanted to become a professional pianist. He remembers everything. And for the first time, he thought, these things weren't meant to discourage him, but to show him how far he had come. The loudspeaker rang out. Flight attendants prepare for departure. Captain Reedman stepped out one last time, his voice more serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for your patience. We will be departing shortly." He looked at Nathaniel, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. Nathaniel responded, not happy, not upset, just a confirmation that this wasn't the end of the story, and the captain understood that. Elijah looked at the captain and asked, "Mr. Brooks, what happened earlier? Will it affect you?" Nathaniel chuckled, a little surprised by the question. "What do you mean, I see? You said some very strong things. Very direct, I think. Many leaders wouldn't do that. Why? Because they are afraid of affecting their image." Nathaniel rested his hands on his thighs, intertwining his fingers. "Elijah, a leader does not lead to maintain an image, but to uphold justice for those who have no voice." He turned to him, his eyes more real than ever. "If an airline treats its passengers badly and the CEO remains silent, then that airline has no soul." Elijah nodded slightly. "That is, you're not afraid." Nathaniel looked straight ahead. "I was afraid. I was afraid many times." But a mature person is not someone who is not afraid, but someone who does not let fear dictate the right thing to do. Elijah felt his heart warm as if someone had lit a candle in a room he thought was filled with darkness. The plane began to taxi slowly. The slight vibration that traveled up the soles of his feet made Elijah tremble again, but this time it was a tremble of excitement, not fear. He looked out the window. The runway was lit by lights long and wide like a great door opening into the future. Nathaniel tilted his head and asked, "Ready?" Elijah took a deep breath. "Yes, I think I'm ready." "Good," Nathaniel replied, "because New York is waiting for you." That sentence, simple as it is like the first note in a concerto, opening up a vast space where dreams can be touched with both hands. The plane accelerated, the engines roared, the cabin tilted slightly, Elijah's body pressed lightly against the seat. And when the plane's wheels leave the ground, Elijah felt like part of his old fear was leaving as well. Some flights take you to a new city. Some flights take you to a better version of yourself. And this flight did both. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the engine noise became quieter and more even. The cabin gradually sank into a quiet space, the kind of quiet that only exists on night flights, both peaceful and easy to face oneself. The lights dimmed to a warm yellow, gently illuminating the faces that still echoed with the tension from earlier. Elijah leaned back in his seat, his fingers lightly tracing the seam of his seatbelt. He couldn't sleep. His emotions were like a cup that was too full. The slightest shake would send it spilling over. Nathaniel Brooks sat next to him. Though he was looking at a document on a small iPad, Elijah knew he wasn't really paying attention. The man was still watching every little movement in the cabin, like someone used to monitoring unrest, not out of protection, but out of responsibility. After a while, when the cabin was quiet, Elijah asked softly, "Mr. Brooks, did you ever think you would become CEO?" Nathaniel looked up a little surprised by the question. He put the iPad aside and leaned back in his chair. "No," he said honestly. "I never thought so when I was young." "Why?" Nathaniel smiled, but his eyes were deep and dark. "Because there is no one like me there?" Elijah looked at him unblinking. "I grew up in Chicago," Nathaniel began. "My neighborhood wasn't the kind of place where you'd think you could be a manager, let alone a CEO. Black kids in that neighborhood were taught to play it safe, to stay out of trouble. But he hesitated. "I dreamed bigger." Elijah whispered, "But it's not easy to dream big when everyone keeps trying to make you small." A sad smile crossed Nathaniel's lips. "Yes, I was rejected from a scholarship program despite being at the top of my class. They said I didn't fit in with the culture." Elijah squeezed his hand. "I know that feeling," he said, "that you have to be twice as good to be treated like everyone else." "I understand," Nathaniel replied. "And I promise you, no one should have to live like that." The cabin was silent. The engine provided a steady background hum like the heartbeat of a plane. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly, the city lights in the distance looking like forgotten rays. Elijah took a deep breath, then asked something he had been keeping in mind since the plane took off. "Mr. Brooks, if at that time you didn't stand up, what would have happened to me?" He did not ask with a reproachful tone, but with the sincerity of someone who wanted to understand the world he had to step into. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. "Elijah, you will be taken to airport security. They will ask you many questions. They will write in the report that you were disruptive, that you disobeyed orders. And even if they let you go, you may still be refused reboarding. Elijah was silent, his heart sinking. Some airlines, Nathaniel continued, will put you on a passenger of concern list, and for a long period of time. Every time you fly, you will be screened individually. Elijah's voice softened. Just because you put the piano in its place. Yes, said Nathaniel. Just because. Elijah looked up, his eyes bright but sad. Why? Is it so easy? Just one wrong word, one action of theirs, can destroy my future. Nathaniel turned around, looking straight at him. Because the system is imperfect, he said, and sometimes it relies too much on speculation rather than facts. But Elijah, because the system is imperfect, it needs people who will stand up. He paused, his voice deeper. In that moment you had no one. But if you remember this, that you deserve to be heard, to be respected, you will never feel small again. Elijah looked down at his hands. His fingers were used to the keys, used to long pieces, hours of solitary practice. But now they trembled with something else because he realized his own voice mattered too. Ron Matthews walked by looking at Elijah and Nathaniel. He stopped, smiling slightly. Everything okay here? Nathaniel nodded. Okay. Ron turned to Elijah. Hey, Elijah, when we land, if you need, I can help you get your things or take you out first. I want to make sure you don't get into any more trouble. Elijah nodded slightly. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate it. Ron smiled, patted the back of his chair, and continued down the cabin. He had changed. In just a few hours, Ron was no longer the boy who had feared the chief flight attendant's gaze. He was more assertive, more vocal. And Elijah realized fear wasn't just something black people carried. It was present in many people, just in different forms. But kindness, too. After a while, as the cabin lights dimmed even more, Elijah leaned his head against the window. The sky was dark, the faint streaks of light in the distance making him think of weekend nights practicing alone in the small living room. Nights when his mother would fall asleep early, exhausted, and he would try piece by piece to pursue a dream no one was sure would actually come true. Elijah said, his voice as if he was only talking to himself, Mr. Brooks, why is it that people are more likely to believe bad things about a black man than good things? Nathaniel did not answer immediately. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. Elijah, because a part of this country's history is still burned into the minds of many people, and every day we must fight to change that, not with anger, but with our presence. He looked at Elijah, his eyes warm and strong. When you play the piano, you are proving that you are worthy. When you speak kindly, when you keep your composure, when you walk with faith, you are making the world see you differently. Elijah took a deep breath. His heart felt a little lighter. I just want to be treated fairly. And I will, Nathaniel said. Because today I stood up to something wrong. Even though I didn't scream, I didn't lose my temper. My calm was the strongest protest. Elijah smiled for the first time since it happened. The plane began to veer, slightly shaking the cabin slightly. It felt like the plane was changing course too, just like Elijah's life had changed. Nathaniel looked at him for a moment, and then asked Elijah, Do you know what makes you special? Elijah shook his head. It's not because you play well, Nathaniel said. It's not because you're smart or polite. He pointed a finger at Elijah's chest. It's because your heart is strong enough to survive the pain without letting it change you. Elijah was silent, his heart clenched and unclenched. It was a hard feeling to describe, warm and stinging at the same time, but the kind that made a person grow in seconds. The seatbelt sign came back on. Captain Reedman announced, We are expecting some mild turbulence ahead. Please remain seated. Nathaniel sighed softly, leaning back. Elijah, take a break. You'll need a lot of energy later. Elijah looked up in surprise. Why, Nathaniel smiled? Because when you get to New York, you won't be the one leaving Atlanta in tears. You'll be the one walking down the aisle with stronger legs. A ding sound was heard as the plane flew into light turbulence. Elijah looked out the window. The plane rocked slowly, not ominously, just a reminder that the sky was never still, and he understood. Life isn't always smooth, but once you take off, some shaking is natural. He closed his eyes. For the first time since the day began, Elijah felt truly at peace, and the flight continued on toward New York, carrying a boy who was no longer afraid. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, shaking enough to make the passengers sway slightly. But Elijah wasn't worried. The shaking didn't feel as scary as what had happened on the ground. There were storms in life, far more terrifying than the wind in the sky. Nathaniel sat still, listening for every slight change in the engine. Sound a habit of a man who had read thousands of technical reports, been on countless flights and witnessed too many incidents for his memory to recall. He suddenly asked, "Elijah, have you ever flown this far alone?" Elijah shook his head. "No. Back then, every time I went anywhere, it was with Mom. She always said I wasn't ready to fly away on my own. And now," Elijah sighed softly, "I think I'm a lot more ready today." Nathaniel smiled. "Good, because sometimes maturity doesn't come from easy days. It comes from days like this." The new flight attendant, a girl named Alyssa, came over and gently placed a bottle of water on Elijah's small table. Her voice was soft and slightly shaky, perhaps because she knew the CEO was sitting in front of her. "Sir, if you need anything else, just ring the bell." Elijah nodded tactfully. "Thank you." Alyssa smiled and turned away. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment, then slowly said, "People like Alyssa, they will be the generation that changes everything. Not with big words, but with small kindnesses." Elijah was silent for a second, then asked Mr. Brooks, "Are there many stewardesses like Diana?" A straight question. A painful question. Nathaniel sighed but did not shy away. "Not much, but enough to hurt. They're not always mean, but sometimes they're afraid of losing power, and they're afraid of facing themselves." Elijah touched his finger to the mouth of the water bottle and said softly, "I don't understand." "Why should we consider guests a threat?" Nathaniel Quay sang. "Power without control easily confuses responsibility and pride." Elijah bowed his head, thinking for a long time. He thought of Diana, her cold eyes, her words so hard they seemed programmed. And he wondered, had she ever been different, or had her harshness become a habit, one that no longer distinguished right from wrong? At that moment, Ron Matthews stepped forward. He bent down and whispered to Nathaniel, "Mr. Brooks, I just heard a private announcement from the crew. It seems that down there in Atlanta they have reported the incident to the airline security office." Nathaniel looked at Ron, his eyes sharp. "What does security want?" Ron licked his lips, slightly embarrassed. "They want Diana's official report, but since she's suspended on the spot, they're asking the captain to submit the report instead." Elijah listened, his heart beating faster. He whispered, "Mr. Brooks, does that mean it's not over yet?" Nathaniel put his hands on the armrest, his voice calm. "It's okay. We'll deal with it when we land. They can't act on a false report anymore." Elijah looked at him. There was no wavering in Nathaniel's eyes. Not arrogant confidence, but the calm of someone who had faced more battles than he could count. As Ron left, Elijah turned to ask Mr. Brooks, "Do you ever get tired of battles like this?" Nathaniel smiled slightly, not a happy smile, but the smile of someone who had passed through many arrows. "It's tiring, a lot. There are days when I wonder if I'm really making a difference, or if I'm just fighting a wave that's too big." Elijah frowned. "So why do you still do it?" Nathaniel looked out the window where the clouds were tearing into strange shapes like someone was folding a giant white canvas. "Because if I don't," he said slowly, "the next person to suffer might be a child who has no one to stand up for him." Elijah felt his chest tighten, not with sadness but with understanding. Mr. Brooks wasn't just saving him. He was trying to save others, too. People Elijah had never met but knew were out there somewhere. Alyssa returned with a tray of snacks. "Can I leave it here?" Nathaniel nodded. As she turned away, Elijah called softly, "Alyssa." She stopped and smiled. "Yes," Elijah took a deep breath. "Thank you for not looking at me with suspicion." Alyssa froze. Her eyes softened, warm and genuine, so much so that Elijah had to look away for a second from the sudden surge of emotion. "Honey," she said in her light southern accent, "I have a brother your age, and I want him treated right, wherever he goes." Elijah couldn't say anything more than a shaky smile. Alyssa tapped him lightly on the shoulder and walked away. Nathaniel said softly, "See, there are still many good people." Elijah nodded, feeling his heart truly warm for the first time that day. The plane continued to climb. The clouds opened up, stretching as far as the eye could see. The lights of New York City began to appear far on the horizon, still a thin line, but enough for Elijah to know his future was right there. Nathaniel shifted, sitting up straighter. "Elijah, when you get to the airport, you will be protected. I have already contacted the regional office. Elijah opened his eyes wide. What will they do? They will do the right thing, Nathaniel replied, and they will listen to me. Elijah's chest burned not with fear, but with the feeling that for the first time he mattered, had a voice, had someone who believed in him. A moment later, the cabin fell silent. Elijah leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes. Though he wasn't asleep, he could hear the engine's hum, steady and powerful like a heartbeat. In the dim light of the plane cabin, his thoughts quietly organized. Times. Why is this happening to me? Asterisk. Why is Diana looking at me like that? Asterisk. Why did Mr. Brooks stand up? Asterisk. And why does my heart hurt and yet feel so strangely strong? He remembered his mother's eyes. He remembered the nights she held him, saying, "You are a good thing." In that moment, Elijah believed more than ever that his mother was right. You are not the problem. You never were the problem. Nathaniel saw that Elijah was silent for a long time, so he asked, "What are you thinking?" Elijah opened his eyes and turned. "I was thinking, if I become successful in the future, I want to use my music to show people like me that they are not alone." Nathaniel leaned his elbows on the armrest, tilting his head slightly. "Nice goal, but I still don't know where to start," Elijah admitted. Nathaniel replied in a low but instructive voice, "You don't need to know it all from the beginning. Just do the right thing at each step, like you did today. You stayed calm. You didn't react with anger. You chose kindness." He looked at him, his eyes deep and serious. "That is the first step of those who have true power." Elijah felt his nose sting. He turned to the window to hide his red eyes. At that moment, the cockpit speaker turned on. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now approaching New York. We will begin our descent shortly." Elijah breathed a sigh of relief. Nathaniel smiled. "It's almost there." Elijah adjusted his shirt, adjusted his seatbelt as if mentally preparing himself. "People always adjusted themselves before entering an important place," he asked Mr. Brooks. "When I meet with the company's security, should I tell them everything?" Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Speak the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. The truth is strong enough." Elijah took a deep breath. "I will do that." The plane shuddered as it began to descend. Elijah looked down at the glittering carpet of lights. It occurred to him, New York had never looked so big before. But in that vastness he no longer felt afraid. Because for the first time in his life, there was someone waiting for him on the other side. The lights of New York were so bright beneath the plane that Elijah had to squint to make out the road, the river, the meshing streets of a sleepless city. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a feeling that he was entering a new chapter, too big, too real, too close. Nathaniel watched Elijah for a few seconds, then asked softly, "Ready?" Elijah turned back, smiling slightly. "I think I'm more ready than I was in Atlanta." Nathaniel nodded, adjusting his seatbelt. Outside, the sound of the wind picked up as the plane began to descend. A slight jolt made the passengers sway slightly, but no one seemed to be worried anymore. The initial tension had melted into the warm, silent atmosphere of the cabin. The loudspeaker blared. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Alyssa walked down the aisle, checking her seatbelt. She stopped at Elijah's row and leaned down slightly. "Elijah, are you okay?" Elijah nodded, his voice soft. "Yes, fine. Thank you for everything." Alyssa smiled and gently touched his shoulder. "It wasn't you. It was me. I was able to stay calm in a situation where many adults couldn't." She stood up straight and looked at Nathaniel. "Sir, thank you." Nathaniel responded with a small nod, and Alyssa continued down to the cabin. Elijah watched her, then let out a small breath, a long sigh, to release what he had been holding back all day. As the plane touched down on the runway, the vibration was so strong that Elijah's heart almost jumped out of his chest. The sound of friction grew louder and then slowed down until the plane was rolling smoothly on the ground. The surrounding passengers let out a sigh of relief. One whispered, "Finally, another long day." But Elijah couldn't breathe, because he knew the hardest part was still ahead. The plane stopped. Captain Reedman spoke up. "Welcome to New York, ladies and gentlemen. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off." Elijah Quay sang Nathaniel. "They are waiting for me out there, right?" Nathaniel did not answer with the word "yes," he said in a soft and firm voice. "And they will listen to you." Elijah swallowed. "But what if they still believe Diana?" Nathaniel replied immediately, not letting Elijah sink into worry. They won't. I've sent the report and the video. You won't be going into the interrogation room. We'll be going into the formal conference room. And Elijah, you don't have to say it all by yourself. Elijah's eyes widened. That is, you will go in with me. Of course, Nathaniel replied. Until things clear up. Elijah's anxiety eased as if someone placed a hand on his chest and said, Calm down, you don't have to fight alone anymore. When the seatbelt sign went off, passengers began to stand. Elijah remained seated, his hand on his guitar case in a protective habit. Ron Matthews approached, smiling gently. Elijah, if you want, I can take you to the front of the cabin before the other passengers get off. Elijah nodded his thanks. Ron Quay sang Nathaniel. Sir, there are airline staff waiting right outside the boarding gate. They say they need to see you and Elijah immediately. Nathaniel stood up. Okay, get us out. But before leaving, he looked at Elijah. Hold the guitar. Don't let it out of your hands. Elijah understood, not because he was afraid of losing it, but because that guitar was his whole story, proof that he came here not to cause trouble, but to pursue his dream. As the cabin door opened, a blast of cold air from the New York airport rushed in. Elijah hunched his shoulders but didn't slow his pace. Just outside the door, 3 people in Bright Wings management uniforms stood waiting. A gray-haired man, a woman holding an iPad, and a JFK airport security officer. They looked at Elijah first, not with suspicion, not with contempt, but with understanding. The gray-haired man spoke first. Mr. Carter, hello. I am Michael Turner, Director of Operations for the New York region. Thank you for your cooperation. Elijah was a little flustered, but tried to keep calm. Hello, sir. Michael looked at Nathaniel and immediately straightened up. Mr. Brooks. We've seen the report, and we're sorry for what happened. Nathaniel nodded slightly. Good. Let's talk in the company conference room. Michael turned to Elijah. Don't worry. This isn't an interrogation. This is just a clarification session to make sure no one misrepresents you again. Elijah felt his heart lighten, as if someone had placed a hand on the back of his neck and removed a string that had been tied for too long. Let's go, Nathaniel said. On the way to the conference room, Elijah walked in the middle, Nathaniel on the right, Ron on the left. The other passengers stood aside, watching him pass. Elijah heard a few voices. Good luck, kid. You deserve justice. Play well in New York. The wishes were small, but Elijah felt them lift him off the ground, step by step. As they reached the escalator, Elijah suddenly asked Nathaniel, his voice hesitant, If things get worse, if I get blamed, will you still stand by me? Nathaniel stopped. He put his hand on his shoulder, not too hard, but firm. Elijah, you did nothing wrong, and I am not on your side because of emotion. I am on your side because of the truth. He spoke slowly, each word engraved in the air. No matter what the outcome, I won't let them hurt my child again. Elijah bowed his head, his lip trembling. He didn't know what to say. Sometimes there are words you hear only once in a lifetime, and they're enough to change the way a child sees the world. They entered the conference room, small, bright, with a long wooden table and leather swivel chairs. There was water on the table, several open files, and a large screen displayed the headline, Internal Incident Review, Flight 2781. Michael Turner pulled out a chair for Elijah. Please sit down. No need to be nervous. Elijah set the guitar case down next to the chair. His hands were still shaking slightly. Nathaniel sat beside him, nodding reassuringly. I'm here. The woman holding the iPad spoke. Elijah, we want to hear your version of events. No cuts, no reinterpretations, just the facts. Elijah took a deep breath. His hands clasped together, his back straight. I will say. Elijah began to tell. From the moment he entered the cabin, from Diana's first glance, from her judging look, her short whistle, to her sharp tone when she made him gate-check the instrument. When Elijah got to the part where Diana accused him of being aggressive, Michael Turner put down his pen, his face dark. When Elijah described the look in her eyes when she said, You're a threat, the woman holding the iPad froze. As Elijah recounted the moment he was pushed off the plane, his voice broke. But he continued, no complaining, no embellishment, just the raw truth. Nathaniel looked at Elijah, and he knew. This child was stronger than he thought. When Elijah finished, the conference room fell silent for a long moment, a silence not of doubt, but of everyone swallowing a lump in their throats. Finally, Michael said, Elijah, thank you. We believe you. Elijah closed his eyes. A breath fell like a stone was lifted from his chest. Michael Quay sang, "Nathaniel, Mr. Brooks, we will handle Diana Cross according to the regulations. Not to mention, the video you sent is enough to consider additional penalties." Nathaniel nodded, his voice restrained. "Good." Then he put his hands on the table and said something that made Elijah look up. "But first, I want us to talk about something else." Michael blinked. "What's up?" Nathaniel looked at Elijah, his eyes softened. "This boy's future." When Nathaniel said that, "this boy's future," the conference room tilted slightly. Not because of the shaking of the airport, but because of the weight of the sentence falling on the table so light, but so deep. Michael Turner paused for a few seconds. The woman holding the iPad, Sandra, blinked faster than usual. The security guard standing by the door also tightened his grip on the clipboard. Elijah was motionless. He looked up at Nathaniel, not understanding what he was doing, but feeling as if he were standing in front of a large door that was slowly being blown open by the wind. Michael cleared his throat. "What do you mean, Mr. Brooks?" Nathaniel turned to Elijah, his eyes saying, "Are you ready to listen?" Elijah nodded slightly. Nathaniel said, "This boy came to New York to take an important test, but because of our staff's misconduct, Elijah almost lost that opportunity." Michael looked at Elijah, then at Nathaniel. "We understand. And we're sorry." "I don't need sorry," Nathaniel interrupted softly but not sharply. "I need action." There was a long pause. Sandra put down her iPad, straightened her back, and was ready to listen. Nathaniel continued. "Elijah Carter must be the story Brightwings Airlines remembers. Not because of the incident, but because of how we handle it." He looked straight at Michael. "I want to create a mechanism to protect young passengers, especially passengers of color, when traveling alone. I want the new process so that no other Elijah will be in the same situation." Michael tilted his head, thinking, "Are you talking about some kind of youth protection policy?" "No," Nathaniel replied immediately. "I'm talking about a full program, the Safe Passage Initiative." Sandra opened her eyes wide. "Sir, that is a national-level project." "I know." Elijah looked at Nathaniel, his heart pounding with every word he spoke. He hadn't thought his story could make such a difference. He'd just counted himself lucky to have been saved from a misunderstanding. But now Nathaniel was turning his pain into light for others. Nathaniel continued, "I wanted Elijah to be the first witness, and the one who laid the foundation for the program." Elijah chuckled. You want me?" Nathaniel turned back and nodded. "Elijah, you have no idea. The way you handled this, your composure, your honesty in reporting everything, that's what we need to learn. Not to teach staff how to treat passengers, but to teach them how to see people." Elijah bowed his head, tears welling in his eyes that he fought to keep at bay. Something in those words touched a part of him that had always been hidden, the desire to be seen as a full person, not a stereotype. Michael sighed, but it was a thoughtful sigh, not a refusal. "We can do it, but it will take a few weeks to draft and get approved." "No," Nathaniel said. "I want the project started right away, tonight." The conference room was dead silent. Even Elijah turned around, surprised. "Tonight," Nathaniel smiled slightly. "Important things cannot be left until tomorrow." Sandra put her hand to her chin, thinking. "Sir? So what do you want to do first?" Nathaniel looked at Elijah. "The first step is to make sure Elijah's future is not affected." Elijah frowned. "You mean the test tomorrow?" Nathaniel laughed. "Not only that." Sandra understood immediately and asked Elijah, "Elijah, do you have a letter of recommendation or an official sponsor for the test?" Elijah blushed. "No, I only have the confirmation email." Sandra nodded. "Good. Then Brightwings will immediately send an official letter of sponsorship to the organizer, confirming that you are a passenger affected by an incident beyond their control." Michael added, "And we will call the screening board directly, making sure your travel history is not being incorrectly reviewed." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. "So, they won't suspect me of being late." Nathaniel placed his large hand on the back of his chair. "Elijah, you will enter the examination as someone who has won a battle before even playing the first note." Elijah trembled, not with fear this time, but with emotion. Michael stood up, opened his laptop, and immediately began composing an email. Sandra checked the documents. The security guard changed his monitoring role and moved into a support position. Elijah watched the scene as if he were witnessing a giant machine moving for him, something he had never imagined in his life. Nathaniel turned back to Elijah. "Elijah, there is one more thing. Elijah blinked, surprised. What else? Nathaniel looked straight at him, his voice gentle but firm enough to make the entire conference room stop. Do you want to tell this story to the entire Bright Wings team? Not today, not right away when you're ready? Elijah was stunned. You speak in front of many people. Not to tell them about the pain, Nathaniel said, but to let them learn what I do better than most adults maintain dignity in the face of injustice. Elijah looked down at his hands. The hands that made music, the hands that shook when they were pulled from the plane, the hands that now held his future. I don't know if I can do it. Nathaniel placed his hand on his shoulder, gentle but powerful. Elijah, you have done the hardest part today. The rest is just the next step. Elijah looked up. For the first time in his life, he felt more than just strong. He felt valuable. Michael finished typing the email and sent it. Sandra quickly read the paperwork and nodded. Step 1 done, Michael said. Now for step 2, protecting Elijah's image. Elijah was a little startled. Protect my image, Sandra explains. Elijah, the video, mister. Brooks recorded could potentially become internal evidence, but we have to make sure no one spreads it and draws too much attention to you. Elijah had never thought of this. He asked softly, Will I be affected? Sandra said in the voice of someone who really understood. Sometimes public attention can hurt a child even if he is the one being harmed. We don't want that to happen to him. Elijah looked at them, people who belonged to a system that had hurt him and was now doing its best to fix it. It made his heart heavy, but a grateful weight. Nathaniel stood up and adjusted his collar. Good. Now, let's move on to step 3. Sandra asked, What is step 3? Nathaniel looked at Elijah, smiling a smile that made Elijah shiver slightly. Let Elijah go back to his hotel room, rest, and prepare for tomorrow's test. Elijah let out a small breath, as if he had just heard a word of release. Michael stood up. We have the car ready. One of our staff will take Elijah to the hotel. Nathaniel shook his head. No need. I'll take you. Michael was a little confused. Sir, but you still have work schedules. Nathaniel smiled very lightly but resolutely. Today, my most important schedule is a child named Elijah Carter. Elijah covered his mouth with his hand, his eyes burning. It wasn't gratitude anymore. It was genuine protection. They stood up. As Elijah picked up the guitar case, Nathaniel said, I keep it as I believe it. Elijah nodded, hugging the instrument to his chest. He turned to look at the room where a child had been listened to like an adult and walked out the door. Tomorrow was a long day. But tonight, he knew he was no longer alone on this journey. The early New York morning breeze blew coolly through the narrow, brick-paved streets of Midtown. The sun was still peeking behind the glass buildings, casting a soft orange glow on the quiet square in front of the Hudson Conservatory. Elijah stepped out of the car, his guitar case clutched to his chest. Today, the most important test of his life came with a calm he never expected. No more chaos, no more fear, just the soft sound of his footsteps and his steadying breaths. Nathaniel Brooks walked beside him, his long black coat on his face, serious but his eyes full of support. Can you sleep? He asked. Elijah nodded slightly. Okay, not much, but I feel calm. Nathaniel chuckled. Good. Calmness is the only thing an artist needs before playing. They walked up the building's gray stone steps. The tall glass doors reflected the two figures, a teenager in a plain white shirt, a CEO whose shoulders were slightly dusty from last night's trip. Two people from two completely different worlds. But at this moment they were standing in the same light. A receptionist opened the door, bowing to Elijah. Good morning, Mr. Carter. The examination board has been notified. When you are ready, we will bring you in. Elijah swallowed. Yes, I'm ready. But before entering, he turned to Nathaniel. Mr. Brooks. I can't say it enough, but thank you. It's because of you that I'm here today. Nathaniel looked at him, his eyes like a straight line deep into the soul. Elijah, you are here because you deserve to be here. I am only giving you back what was taken from you. He gently placed his hand on his shoulder. Play with your heart. Don't play to prove anything to others. Play for yourself. Elijah nodded vigorously. The words were like a thread tying together all the tangled parts of him from the past few years. He was ushered into a large room. White walls, high ceiling, soft acoustics, a perfect setting for live music. The 5 judges sat at a long table in front of them. Each had the solemn look of someone who had heard too much great music and seen too many dreams shattered right before their eyes. The main judge, Mrs. Marilyn Grant, silver hair, bright eyes, looked at Elijah for a long moment before saying, "We heard you had a rough day." Elijah stood up straight, holding his guitar case in his hand. "Yes, it was a little difficult, but I'm here." Marilyn chuckled, slightly more respectful than amused. "Then tell us what made you brave all the obstacles to get here." Elijah opened the case. The key clicked the sound, small but clear in the quiet room. He took out his violin. His fingers touched the familiar body. He remembered his mother's words, "Treat it as you would your own heart." He tuned it briefly, then stood in the center of the room, taking a deep breath. "I present Adagio for the Lost Sky, which I wrote myself." The whole panel paused. One judge asked quietly, "You composed it yourself?" "Yes," Elijah replied. His voice didn't tremble, it was as steady as the bass in the music. "Okay," said Marilyn. "We're listening." Elijah closed his eyes. There was no more Diana Cross's face in his mind, no more shouting, no more suspicious eyes. All that remained was the music, the one thing that had never betrayed him. He put the violin on his shoulder. The atmosphere stopped. Then the sound of the instrument began, soft light, like a drop of light falling on a still lake. The next note was louder. Then a slight tremor, like someone's breath trembling with fear. Elijah tells his story not in words but in sounds. Times, bloody, practice nights. Asterisk times of being looked down upon. Asterisk, a tearful flight. Asterisk, and the moment the man in the black hat stood up in the airport. The music gradually grew louder, like footsteps moving away from fear. At the climax, Elijah pulls out a series of powerful, fast notes, like the sound of wind sweeping through the open plane door as he's dragged out. Then suddenly, the music fell silent. A silence so long that the four judges leaned forward. It was the moment Elijah stood back in the center of the booth, staring injustice in the face. Then he released his hand, drawing out a long legato passage, so beautiful it felt like the listener's heart was squeezed slightly. The ending was so soft, like a sigh of knowing you were protected, like dawn, falling after a long, tiring night. When Elijah put down the instrument, the examination room fell silent, but the silence wasn't cold. It was the kind of silence of people who've just seen something they didn't expect and can't take their eyes off it. Marilyn Grant put her pen down on the table. Her voice was low and slow. "Elijah, it's not just a song, it's a testimony," another judge said. "You turned the pain into sound, subtle, but not spiteful." The third person said, "We hear you. We really hear you." Elijah bowed his head, his eyes stinging but no longer tearing up. He no longer saw himself as the boy who got dragged off the plane he had seen last night. He saw himself as an artist. As Elijah walked out of the examination room, Nathaniel stood up immediately. "Are you done?" Elijah nodded. "I think I did the best I could." Nathaniel looked at him for a second, just a second, and then said, "Elijah, you don't need a report card to know that. Let's go." Out of the building, the afternoon wind blew stronger. Elijah took a deep breath, as if breathing New York air for the first time with his own lungs, not with fear. Nathaniel opened the car door for him, but Elijah stopped Mr. Brooks. "Do you think?" "It's over." Nathaniel looked at him, his eyes soft and rare. "Elijah, things like yesterday don't end overnight." "But," he put his hand on his shoulder, "you conquered the darkness itself." Elijah asked, "And what about the rest?" Nathaniel smiled. "The rest, I'll take care of." A week later, Elijah received the letter. The Hudson Conservatory seal was embossed in the left corner. He was so nervous he had to open it twice. "Congratulations, Elijah Carter, you're accepted." Elijah stood silently in the middle of the small hotel room, holding the paper in his slightly shaking hands. He didn't scream, he didn't jump, he didn't cry. He just closed his eyes to fully feel the feeling of a large door opening for him. When he called Nathaniel, he picked up the phone very quickly. "Elijah, I passed." There was a silence. Then Nathaniel spoke, his voice low but warm enough to melt Elijah's heart. "I believed that before you walked into the examination room." 3 weeks later, at Brightwing's headquarters in Atlanta, Nathaniel Brooks stepped onto the stage in front of more than 400 employees. Behind him is a large screen, "Safe Passage, Initiative." "Inspired by Elijah Carter," Nathaniel said. "Today, we begin to make a change. Not because of one incident, but because of one boy who chose to face injustice with kindness. Elijah stood in the wings, his arms around his guitar, looking at him, his eyes as quiet and bright as the spotlight. When Nathaniel finished his speech, he held out his hand. "Elijah, are you ready?" Elijah stepped out. Hundreds of eyes were on him. But he didn't feel scared, not strange. "You see, this is where you need to stand." Elijah bowed his head, picked up his violin, and played. Not the piece he'd played in the testing room, but the one he'd written that night after he'd learned he'd passed a song of hope. The sound of the violin echoed through the large hall, penetrating every corner of the room and every heart. Nathaniel stood behind, hands clasped in front of his stomach, eyes shining, not because he was proud of being the CEO, but because he was proud of standing up for a child at the right time. When the song ended, the audience stood up and applauded, but Elijah only looked at one person, Nathaniel. He nodded, he smiled, a smile bigger than all the pain of that flight. And from that moment on, no one remembered Elijah as a victim anymore. They remembered him as an artist, as a voice, as someone who turned darkness into light. A black boy was forced off a plane but took off on his own terms. The story of Elijah and Nathaniel is more than just a confrontation between injustice and justice. It touches on something deeper, the weight of human choice. A flight attendant chooses pride. A child chooses patience. A CEO chooses not to turn away. In our daily lives, we face choices like these, sometimes small, sometimes unnoticed. But it is these silent choices that shape our character and leave a lasting mark. The story reminds us that not everyone has the power to change the world, but everyone has the power to change someone's day. A less harsh word can save a life from harm. A timely action can restore trust that someone thought had been lost. As the old saying goes, kindness costs nothing, but it is worth more than any gift. Elijah wasn't protected because he happened to meet the CEO. He was protected because he lived to be seen. Nathaniel stood up because he knew power only matters when it is used in the right place, at the right time, for the right people. Hopefully, as we walk away from this story, each of us will retain one thing. In today's noisy world, let's strive to be a witness who speaks up, not a bystander who looks away. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you believe stories of kindness, justice, and courage should be shared, please like, share, and subscribe. This not only supports us, it helps beautiful stories like this one continue to be told, remembered, and kept alive.